When you combine the Ferrari pedigree with the rapid rise of a young star who has something to prove, and then you throw on top of that an experienced, talented 4-time world champion, all the while you need to be factoring in that they're in equal technology and arguably of equal talent. You have an absolute recipe for disaster brewing. And to make matters worse, you have a rookie team boss whose extensive history and background come in the form of technical engineering as it relates to Formula One racing, and not necessarily the leadership of the team or the factory. Ferrari were destined for a tough 2019, but this tough, I'm not really sure many saw this coming. The goal of this video is to walk through how we got to where we are with Ferrari in 2019, and how the Brazilian Grand Prix was a long time coming. In order to do this, we need to do it in 3 different acts. Who are the players? How did we get here? And what do we do now? Let's begin with Act 1. But before we do, if you're new to this channel, make sure to subscribe. These sorts of videos obviously take a very long time in terms of editing, research, and then presenting the story. You can play a tremendous part in allowing me to keep doing this for you. The only thing I ask of you is to enjoy the video with an open mind, subscribe if you haven't already, share the video if you feel so inclined, but only do so if I earned it. Let's get into it. Sebastian Vettel has been with Ferrari since the 2015 season, where he came from a highly successful career from Red Bull, where he won 4 consecutive world titles. Many of us obviously know the career of Sebastian Vettel as we followed it right before our eyes. But the important thing to call out here, Vettel is proven and established race winner, a world champion, and someone, at least going into the 2019 Formula One schedule, felt very secure in his position with Ferrari. When you have a 4-time established world champion like that, the only thing that could really upset the balance of that dynamic is to bring in a young, hungry, potential world champion. And this has happened to Sebastian Vettel before when he was with Red Bull, and that Red Bull brought in Daniel Ricciardo. We're not here to argue whether Daniel Ricciardo could win a world champion, but it's for sure that Daniel Ricciardo showed promise of a quick, talented young driver. And that season that Daniel Ricciardo was actually brought into Red Bull, Vettel struggled. And many believe that it was this fight with Daniel Ricciardo that took him to Ferrari. All of this is very important when you remember Ferrari decided to promote Charles Leclerc. And at the time, many believed that this was a little bit early to do this. But as we look at the second player in this Act 1, we can understand why Ferrari chose to do what they did. Just as Sebastian Vettel was pegged early on as likely to be a talented Formula One driver, having had a lot of early success, Charles Leclerc was the same exact way. He was deemed a young prodigy in karting and saw a lot of success. He went on to win GP3 just ahead of Alex Albon. He was then signed to the Ferrari Drivers Academy in 2016. He was promoted to F2 and went on to win by more than 70 points. He was promoted yet again to Formula One and making handiwork of Ericsson, whom he outqualified and outscored by a pretty large margin. With some very impressive results under his belt, finishing P13, he was called up to Ferrari. Having seen such a rapid rise of Leclerc in his Formula One career, it was always going to be a difficult task to manage such an established veteran like Vettel, and then such a young talent like Leclerc. Which brings us to the third player in this act, Mattia Binotto. Mattia has essentially spent most of his professional career with Ferrari. He joined the team right around the time Schumacher was actually racing for Ferrari. In 2016, he took over as Chief Technical Officer, replacing James Allison, who went on to Mercedes, and took over the management of the team in 2018, this being his first season ever doing so. All of the players mentioned in this first act all matter. All of these dynamics contribute to what has occurred and unfolded throughout the 2019 season for Ferrari. Act 2. How did we get here? After an impressive, to say the least, winter testing from Ferrari, they were pegged as having the dominant car. Vettel and Leclerc showed real promise early, already proving their pace. They really did look to be the team to challenge Mercedes in their dominant streak in the hybrid era. All of this was called into question immediately as Ferrari opened up with 3 underwhelming race results and 3 controversial team order decisions. Even leading up to the Australian Grand Prix, Mattia had made it very clear that if it came to a 50-50 situation, Vettel was going to receive priority treatment. Now, team orders aren't exactly new to Formula One, but to be so overt about that, especially in the face of a young talent that was already going to throw a little bit of fuel into the fire, to have it play out on track was a whole different story. So once it did, and Leclerc was ordered not to attack Vettel, I think that really was the first sign of things to come. Let's also remember, Leclerc was forced off the track by Vettel. I think on the track, this was also the first sign of things to come, as Vettel was asserting his dominance into that space. To have two teammates already open up with an immediate first lap and first turn incident, that's a little bit worrisome. Things were only exacerbated when they went to Bahrain. Leclerc found himself behind Vettel. Leclerc was asked not to pass him, but decided to do so anyway. This was the first time that the Ferrari team order was disobeyed, as Leclerc ended up showing a lot of pace after he passed Vettel. This was also one of the first time that Mattia had overtly downplayed Leclerc's performance. When asked about the fact that Leclerc had come so close to winning his maiden Grand Prix, and if Leclerc had established himself as a star at Ferrari, Mattia had this to say: "I think we have found a good car this weekend. I'm happy for Charles, but I think we can count on two drivers, and though it has not been a good race for Seb, he was second when he made his mistake, and he can still deliver very well." The question was clearly directed at whether Leclerc was a young talent, and with the car failing Leclerc when he was well on its way to his win, but instead decided to talk about Vettel. Now, if I'm Leclerc after that Grand Prix and I hear that, that's a little bit off-putting to me as well. Now we move on to the third Grand Prix of the year, which was China. And again, we see Ferrari dictating the race from the pit wall. Leclerc is asked to move aside around lap 11, and this time he obeys the order, but he doesn't back off, and Vettel doesn't move on. Vettel was quicker at that point in the race, but once they pass, he doesn't take advantage of his new clear air. After the interview that Mattia had given, I think this was the straw that broke the back for Leclerc. Leclerc had obeyed two of the three orders already given to him in his first three Grand Prix with Ferrari, and each time he felt like he was given the worst hand. Now, I don't really think that this is the issue. Team orders aren't the issue. The issue was that these team orders weren't necessarily pushing Ferrari any further. The team orders were really just driving the drivers apart. Toto Wolff was actually asked about this, the team boss for Mercedes, and I think he said it best. Nevertheless, once you start doing these things, it becomes more complicated because you start to set a precedent and you're opening up a can of worms, and then you might have to call every single race that the cars behind would say, "I can go quicker." This is consistent with how Ferrari were actually making their team orders, looking at the pace, especially early on in the race, and not letting it play out. So the precedent was set very early in Australia that whoever happens to be the quicker driver at that particular instance, now they're going to expect the team order to favor them. So by China, things are already ripping apart. You have a team boss who is handing out team orders based on nothing more than whatever driver is saying they're the fastest at that current time. A young star who feels like he's been robbed of his first race win of his career and also been given a poor hand for his first three races at Ferrari. And a four-time world champion who thinks he deserves the team orders he's been given, despite the pace he's shown on track. And thus far into the schedule, this is consistent with what Ferrari set out to do and said what they would do. They were going to favor Vettel in these situations. But the issue is more that these situations didn't warrant a team order, and Mattia had already set that up as a leader. Mattia was not managing these drivers. He was cultivating a culture in which these drivers were pitted against each other. Who can make the better case for why they deserve the team order that's actually going to favor them? With two drivers like this, what likely needed to be done was set the precedent very early that you dictate the team order. You dictate and take matters into your own hand based on your own race performance, how things are going to play out. And this is what Toto was getting at. And if you are rolling your eyes right now, listening, going, well, they've called team orders too. Calling team orders in Russia to win the championship and to secure that, this is much different than race by race, lap by lap even, looking at where the pace is and deciding right then and there that team order should be called. There have been plenty of times when Mercedes didn't call team orders. And we move on to Azerbaijan and Baku, and this is where Leclerc's image begins to be hurt. He's winning all weekend, he's showing he has the pace, and he ends up shunting when he doesn't really even need to. It's a very, very poor error, and one that Leclerc was very quick to own up to. But also, this hurt his cause, as he tries to say he should be the one, that he should be the driver that is in control of that team. To make that sort of error, it should make leadership question whether something like this can be trusted to him. He showed that he's still a young driver, no matter how talented he is. And at that point in time, while Leclerc was showing brilliant flashes, Vettel was technically a little bit more consistent of the two. So just as Leclerc began to make his case, he ends up shooting himself in the foot in Baku. So we see a frustrating Leclerc, everything building up in Baku, transition into Monaco when he's severely screwed over by his garage. But I will be the first to say, I'm not really sure how much he pushed back against this, and it could have been a decision of hindsight for him to be so frustrated. But I would like to think that drivers have a little bit of say when you look at cutoff time, but in Monaco, if you remember, Leclerc was asked to wait and tried to make the cutoff time. He ended up being too late in Q1 and missed up qualifying entirely. This set up a very poor weekend for him, one of which he was very excited for and was looking to be dominant, or at least competitive, in his home race, mind you. To be sent out because of a team error and a miscalculation must be very frustrating. So he's already felt like team orders and strategy have been against him. Now he's watched actual execution by the team let him down. And by this point, you can see the case already built itself, at least for Leclerc, and how frustrated he's become. And without any major significant result that shocked other than what was potential race lead in Bahrain, Leclerc is going to really need to do something here. In Canada, we see Vettel on his way to his first win of the season, and we see it taken away from him from a decision by the FIA. This alone plays a massive role in the increasingly frustrated Sebastian Vettel. Being teammates with someone who is trying to outperform you, having not gotten a race victory in so long, it's very important he takes as many wins and as many points as possible. And to work so hard to have it taken away in controversial fashion, that's got to set him back. The time is ticking until Leclerc gets his first victory, because I think that's really when things are going to start to blow up between the two. So far, Leclerc has just been a mild threat. When we see Leclerc's pace in Austria and fight with Verstappen, we could really see the future of Formula One. I think coupled with the fact that Canada just happened, and when you look at things like Austria, where Vettel has to watch his teammate basically battle out to the last couple laps for a race win, that's really got to eat away at him. So when we get to Silverstone, we see Vettel make a very poor decision and end up running into the back of Max Verstappen. It's not any different than Vettel being desperate for his win, but to see his teammate come so close, not once, but twice, this could be the impetus for him to be a little bit more desperate for his results and start to make some of these mistakes we're going to see coming up. Austria also marked a new type of driving style we haven't seen yet from Leclerc, which is a little bit more aggressive. The FIA's decision to uphold the overtake by Max Verstappen when Leclerc thought he was pushed off the track, this births a little bit more of an aggressive driving style from Leclerc. This more aggressive driving style, mixed with the fact that he's perfectly willing to disobey team orders, that's going to create a little bit more of an overall unhealthy situation where two drivers are becoming more frustrated, whether with their lack of performance on track or with the fact that the team are not fully supporting them. But the summer break will start a new chapter in the Ferrari team dynamic. The return of the summer break sees the return of Leclerc's performance, and he gets his first ever race victory of his career in Belgium. The Spa victory also showed glimpses of Leclerc's new driving style when he had his on-track fiefdoms with Hamilton. This more aggressive driving style of Leclerc looked to be accompanied with a little bit more of an aggressive media style too. He became a little bit more unwilling to accept the fact that he would be considered number two in this situation. To escalate the tensions even further, Leclerc went on to win the Italian Grand Prix. Now, that Grand Prix for any Ferrari driver is arguably the most important on the calendar as it's in front of their home fans. This is also a feat that Vettel had failed to do in his time with Ferrari since 2015. Monza really was the lowest of the lows for Vettel, at least in 2019, as he watched his teammate win in Italy. And then at the same time, he had a pretty embarrassing spin on lap 1. On top of all that, he was given points in his license for an incident he had returning to the track after that spin. That brought him just within 3 points of a race ban. A race ban at that juncture would have been costly, very costly for Vettel. Vettel needed more than anything to get things back on his side. After watching Leclerc win back-to-back races, he needed to win Singapore, and that's exactly what he did. And if Belgium and Italy heightened things for the situation in that dynamic, Singapore absolutely brought them to new levels. Because this was a time in which Leclerc had just won back-to-back Grand Prix, had all the momentum, and then he felt Vettel was given the better strategy as he was not told about the fact that Vettel had pitted early and felt that it was an undercut against his position, when in fact it really was to protect against the Max Verstappen undercut, and it took Ferrari from a 1-3 finish to a 1-2 finish. At the end of the day, it was the right call, and this is the time in the video which I'll say they did make the right call. But for the step forward they took for the strategy call in Singapore, they took 2 more back when Mattia came out after and said they considered a swap. It's another fail by Mattia. All he had to do was say that was the better strategy. Ferrari took more points. It was the right call. Singapore was also the time in which Leclerc was the loudest over team radio. Up until this point, and you would think that Vettel's experience serves him well here, but he's been relatively quiet about strategy over the radio. Vettel's win in Singapore breathed new life into his hopes to beat his teammate. While it looked like Lewis was going to clinch the championship, he could at least win against Leclerc. And this was the issue. He had hope, and rightfully so. So the things that played out in Russia are absolutely of no surprise. But it was another situation in which Ferrari made a choice to have a team orders plan to protect against a advancing Lewis Hamilton. And somehow Ferrari managed to botch even this. As you'll recall, Lewis went up the inside, Vettel took the slipstream and the toe and passed Leclerc. The plan seemed to be, once Vettel had overtaken Leclerc, he would give the spot back. Now, we're not going to talk about this too much in the video, but I've made other ones about this specifically. As if things weren't already strained enough, Leclerc 100% lost trust in Vettel at Russia. All of it. And from Vettel's perspective, I'm not even sure he had trust for Leclerc by the time they got to Russia. After the Grand Prix, Vettel came out and begrudgingly said he probably should have given that spot back. But by then, Leclerc's frustrations were already very clear. He had voiced his frustration for 9 straight laps during the Grand Prix. They arrived in Japan with little to zero trust for each other. Leclerc's aggressive driving style showed itself again as he had a first lap incident with Max Verstappen. Ended up taking Max Verstappen out of the race on a lap 1 incident, but carried on despite the damage. Again, I made a 40-minute video about this one. I feel very strongly about what Ferrari did. I think this had less to do with Leclerc, although I don't think his hands were clean, and this had everything to do with Ferrari. Whereas this entire video and story have been all about the driver dynamics that led to what happened in Brazil. At this point, it's totally understandable what happened. But the Japanese Grand Prix showed the true colors of Ferrari's leadership. If you're wondering how I could defend Leclerc after the Japanese Grand Prix and his decisions to stay out and spew carbon fiber on the track, you just have to watch that video to really understand, because there's a lot of things that weren't reported, or there's a lot of things that were misreported. And I go into very, very great detail in that video, which I'll put down below in the description if you want to check it out. To summarize though, Ferrari and Mattia in particular showed that they were willing to keep their drivers in the dark. Ferrari didn't go out of their way to warn Leclerc that the front wing was about to fall off. It wasn't even Leclerc who decided to stay out. He asked a single question about staying out. Ferrari told him to box just about 3 seconds before the pit lane actually arrived to Leclerc. Then on the next lap, which people have the issue with, Leclerc was actually told to stay out in no uncertain terms, being essentially yelled at through the microphone by his race engineer. Not to mention, this was after the piece of carbon fiber fell off his car and almost hit Lewis and went through his halo. Ferrari watched that happen in real time. The only reason they told him to stay out was, in their eyes, the worst was done. So they didn't care about what happened to Leclerc. They didn't care about what happened to anyone else on the grid. They just told him to stay out because the pieces had already fallen off. What's the point? Also add into the fact that they promised Michael Masi that he was actually coming in. Michael Masi had an issue with the fact that he stayed out lap 1. He went on to lap 2, carried on. Ferrari, Mattia told Masi he was coming in at the end of lap 2. After all that happened, they yelled stay out despite promising Masi, and at that point, Masi stepped in and forced him to come in. And that's what happened in the Japanese Grand Prix in summation. After the race, Mattia was interviewed, and he was still expressing frustration that the FIA had forced him to bring in Leclerc. Sebastian ended up coming in third in the Japanese Grand Prix, and Leclerc, to this point, still hasn't seen the podium since. With a string of poor performances, and Ferrari well off the pace in the United States, the Brazilian Grand Prix was here, and they needed to get results. Leclerc went into Interlagos in third place. Throughout free practice and going into qualifying, Verstappen showed that he was probably going to be the front runner at this race. Ferrari had decent qualifying, but Verstappen ended up taking pole and never looked back. Verstappen ended up winning the race, but let's leapfrog to lap 66 of the Brazilian Grand Prix. Thus far, throughout the entire video, we've talked about how things have come apart. We've showcased multiple examples where Ferrari has failed their strategy. We've talked about many times where Mattia has had his hands in the mix, has dictated the Ferrari pace and the strategy. It should speak volumes to you that Leclerc has won the most amount of poles, but has the worst conversion when you look at how many times he's actually won the race and how he converts those poles into points. Many will say that has everything to do with race pace, but at the end of the day, many cars who have gotten pole don't have the best race pace, but they do have more points and more wins than Leclerc. It has more to do with the fact that, as we've proven throughout this video, they have time and time and again failed strategy. Leclerc has taken pole and they've blew it on strategy. So we're on lap 66 of the Brazilian Grand Prix. There are only 2 races left, both of them vying for the 3rd place in the Drivers' Championship, both seeing Max Verstappen pull ahead, knowing how important these points are. Both of them, time and time again, throughout this season, given up their position, have listened to team demands, have obeyed and sometimes disobeyed team orders. Both drivers feeling like they are owed something. Both drivers feeling like they have been deprioritized in some way, shape, or form by the team. Both drivers seeing their team boss favor the other driver and take their side. Both drivers not trusting that Ferrari are going to take action and understand the situation to protect them. Both drivers wanting to prove that they are the quicker driver going into Abu Dhabi. If there is a team order to give, Abu Dhabi, you're going to need it with the final race, things being so close. When you dictate strategy as much as Ferrari have and failed your drivers as much as Ferrari have, why would any of the Ferrari drivers trust each other? Both are looking out for themselves and how they can perform better and get more points out of that car, not knowing what the team is going to say next to them, not knowing who's going to be asked to yield next. Not to mention you have a young driver who's set to prove himself on the biggest stage in Formula One. And you have a driver who's been there before, a 4-time world champion, who's set to not be outshined by a younger rising star. And you have a first-time team boss who has to manage both of these dynamics and never done this before. What happened next, everyone should have saw coming a mile away. But the situation on lap 66 and how they made their contact is pretty simple. You have a driver, Vettel, on the outside who's just been passed and wants to come back. Passes him on the outside, thinks no way Leclerc will let contact happen. He'll move over. Leclerc, seeing this happen, watching himself just make a clean overtake in a respectful way on the highest overtaking percentage and the most successful overtaking spot in the entire track, he waited. He'll think, Vettel will see me here and will yield. If you're either driver, if you're watching this, are you confused why neither of them decided to yield? Isn't it understandable after seeing how things played out why both drivers think they're deserved of that spot? Act 3. What do we do next? This is more than just a one-time incident. This is more than just a split-second decision. This is 19 races built up. This is their entire career in one little move. This is the 6th different time that we can specifically point to where Mattia has stepped in and failed both of them. So deciding blame for something like this is pretty simple. Ferrari need to step in one more time and take blame here. Ferrari as a team and leadership have failed these drivers. Ferrari has created an environment where these drivers cannot yield to each other. They simply don't trust each other, but more than anything, they don't trust their team to make the right call. It's common for teammates to come together on the track, but it's not common for teammates to have to try to understand how the next race will be dictated. It's not common for drivers to have to understand how the team is going to interpret something. How is this going to look on camera? How is this going to be interpreted? And Ferrari has created a situation in which that matters. The optics matter more than anything, more than trust for your fellow driver on the track. And that's the environment Ferrari has cultivated, and that's the reason Ferrari is the reason. Leadership is the reason this happened, and leadership needs to step in and take ownership for this failure. The worst thing Ferrari can do is make one of the drivers accept blame, because really, Mattia should. Ferrari should. It's what the factory deserves. It's what the drivers deserve. It's what the fans deserve. For a team boss to take ownership of a situation they created. Seeing the way the team has been managed throughout the 2019 season, there's just no way that they make the right call here. There's just no way that they take ownership of the situation. Ultimately, if Ferrari does make the wrong call, if Ferrari decides to hang one of the drivers out to dry in this situation, if they end up putting the blame on one of the drivers, it's likely going to be Vettel, and that's just not going to be a good situation. Leclerc seemed to have a little bit of trust left, but his actions in Brazil, showing that he wouldn't even move an inch, despite knowing Vettel may have been out of line, he still could have moved an inch, a little, and he chose not to. Both of these drivers have exhibited they have no trust. There's no way that these drivers can drive next to each other. And in a final act of absolutely running this team into the ground, if Ferrari pin the blame on one driver, this driver, whoever it is never going to trust their team again. Vettel will never trust that the team will have his interest. Vettel will always pick himself in a situation where it's him or Leclerc. And while you could argue that's already been occurring, it's for sure going to be exacerbated. How do you put two of the best cars on the grid next to each other knowing that's the case? I wouldn't be terribly shocked if after the 2019 season, one of these drivers wasn't at Ferrari. But they both are under contract through the next season, and I'm just not sure how it's going to work, knowing that the management is certainly not changing. Hopefully, you're still here, and if you're still here, I cannot thank you enough. Of course, these videos take a very long time to edit, to research, and to tell the story, and I thank you for every single second you spent with me. As we get closer and closer to the off-season, this sort of content is exactly what I want to make for you. This longer content that tells the story rather than reports the news. You guys really do dictate a lot of the content on here, so if you have any requests, put them in the description box below. I look forward to keep entertaining you on Formula One Matters and Formula One Stories, and thank you from the bottom of my heart. See you guys soon.